The statue of Robert E. Lee in Richmond, Virginia, has recently been removed from its pedestal in order to compensate for that. Let me say a few words in appreciation of Robert E. Lee. The title is, quote, "The Battle of Gettysburg was Robert E. Lee's greatest victory." Now, anybody who knows anything about the Civil War knows that Robert E. Lee did not win the Battle of Gettysburg. But I'm saying that he did win it. It was his greatest victory because it meant that this loss, this defeat, ensured that the South would remain part of the United States. And that was a tremendous step forward. And so it really was Lee's greatest victory. Victory through defeat. Victory disguised as defeat, you might say. Just think how terrible it would have been if Lee had won that battle and the South had won the Civil War. What a tragedy. What an incredible loss that would have been. They say that before that battle, Lee had attended church service where the preacher had impressed him. The evangelist might have said that if a person attempts something using merely human skill and techniques, if you succeed, you really can't say that it was God that gave you the victory. But if a person puts aside mere human tactics and just steps out in faith and turns everything over to God, well then, if you do succeed, you really can say that it must have been God that gave you the victory. That may have played a role in the way Lee conducted the Battle of Gettysburg. For it's a known fact that he did forsake certain conventional moves that army generals usually make. One general at Lee's side advised him to do A, B, and C, General Longstreet, and Lee rebuffed him. Lee was determined to fight the battle his way and not over-depend on human technique. He just threw his men forward and depended on God's grace and intervention to come to his aid. What was particularly counterintuitive and against common sense was that Lee ordered General Pickett to his charge. He ordered Pickett to send his men forward in a mad charge at the Union line from like a mile away. This order was given, and Pickett went forward. His division went forward in the face of withering firepower. The Union forces had recently been armed with new rifles, repeating rifles that could fire several rounds before they have to stop and reload. Now this was a decisive change. With these new advanced weapons, the North had a tremendous advantage. But Lee defiantly chose to ignore this advantage. Defiantly ignore. Pickett's charge, several thousand men in his division were slaughtered. Pickett remarked afterward, quote, I no longer have a division. All because Lee dismissed this human factor, the Union forces' superior firepower. He treated it as though it was a minor thing compared to the greater factor of God's almighty power to intervene and give the victory to whoever he chose. I repeat, Lee knew the North has superior weapons, but he defiantly chose to throw his faith on God and depend on God. This was totally foolhardy, but it was an act of faith, and for that, Lee deserves credit. The rebels withdrew after 3 days, and as they walked south on this road, General Lee was mounted on his horse, and as each group of men walked by, Lee apologized, saying, "It's all my fault." He said this repeatedly as each group of men passed by, and when they had finished, he apologized until all the men had heard his apology. Lee trusted in the Lord, and the Lord came through for him, but not in the way that he had expected. But in the end, the South won a tremendous victory in the sense it gained the best victory it could possibly hope for, the priceless privilege of remaining part of the glorious USA. Truly, the Battle of Gettysburg was Lee's greatest victory. It's not that the South, it's not just that the South was reunited with the North. Rather, the end of slavery freed the South from the curse that it was under. The curse that comes when any nation is a nation of illiterates. Freed slaves went from being illiterates to educated citizens. They went to school for the first time. You see, during slavery, it was forbidden, it was against the law to teach slaves how to read and write. This was a complete betrayal of the Protestant Reformation. America was a Protestant nation at this time, overwhelmingly Protestant. And the foundation of Protestant Reformation, Protestantism, is that everybody gets educated so that everyone can read the Bible for themselves. As you know, the Catholics deprive people of the Bible in the vernacular only Latin Bibles were permitted, and church services were in Latin at that time. And so Protestants prided themselves in people getting access to the Bible in terms of being able to hear the English Bible at church and being able to read an English Bible at home. So the law banning education for blacks, like I say, it was totally against the Protestant Reformation. This was a total betrayal. This was like Judas kissing Christ. Total betrayal. The South literally put slavery above God, above the Bible at any rate. This was grounds for a real curse from heaven. Slave owners went against the Apostle Paul's gospel. He preached a gospel of equality. That's from 2 Corinthians 8, verse 14. And he pronounced a curse on anyone who tampered with his gospel. Galatians 1, verse 8 and 9. Finally, whatever success the Confederacy could have had as a country of its own, of the South could have had as a country of its own, that success could not compare with the much greater success that the South has enjoyed as being part of a much larger country, namely the United States of America. This is especially true when we consider the Confederacy was a whites-only democracy. Whereas today, the South is part of an interracial democracy. Yes, the USA has become a showcase of how successful an interracial democracy can be. Our success means the whole world can see that interracial democracy can succeed, can work. It can be adopted by the whole world. It will be adopted by the whole world because of the United States of America. So you can see that the Battle of Gettysburg was indeed Robert E. Lee's greatest victory. Part 2. In the Gettysburg Address, Lincoln warned that victory by the South would mean the end of democracy. Government of the people, quote, would perish from the earth, unquote. Now, that was totally untrue if you think in terms of only a whites-only democracy. For if the South had won the war, they would continue to have elections, they would have democracy, but it wouldn't be a real democracy, for the government's power would be used to keep minorities down in their place. And so democracy would be used against the purpose of democracy. It would become a travesty of real democracy, and so it would not be democracy at all. It would perish from the earth. So it was in that larger sense that Lincoln's words really do make sense. They actually do make sense after all. The real tragedy of the Gettysburg Address is that Lincoln never got to explain what he was getting at when he said democracy was in danger of perishing from the earth. But now, at last, we can understand the Gettysburg Address like it was meant to be understood. Please look to the description box under the video. I'm going to put a transcript summarizing this video, and I want you to make a paper copy, because later on this year I'm expecting EMP to destroy computers and to destroy the electric grid. So if you have the video on paper, it will be preserved. And Russia is going to bomb this country because we have disarmed, and then Christ will come and take away Russia's victory. I want to emphasize, like I usually do at the end of each video, the time that Russia will rule the world will only be 5 months. That's from Revelation 9, verse 5 and verse 10. These preachers that say 7 years, they're totally out to lunch. Christ said, "I come quickly," and that means that from the time that the tribulation starts, in other words, the time that Russia takes over the world, until the time that Christ comes, it will be a very short period. And so he really will come quickly if you count from the time that Russia takes over the world. And if the period was 7 years, he would not be coming quickly. But if he comes after just 5 months, he really will be coming quickly. That's from Revelation 3, verse 12, and Revelation 22, verse 7, and 12, and 20. I ask for any comment you may make on behalf of this video. P.S. One last thing about General Lee. Somebody asked him at some point what regrets he had. And from what I read, his answer was the only regret he had was that he ever took a military education. In other words, he regretted being a general. I think it's too bad that he could not have said, I might have been smarter and more helpful to Virginia if I had accepted President Lincoln's offer to be the head of the Union forces. This is especially true when you consider that Lee personally was against slavery. He should have been man enough to be willing to fight against slavery and realize that he would be helping his state of Virginia. But he could not make that, he could not handle that. He could not understand that during the war. But even after the war, he seemed that he could not articulate that statement, which is, I think, a weakness on his part.